now.
Perfect. Go ahead.
Holberg,
Yes.
Bell,
Yes.
Bourne,
Yes.
Cole, Hoffman,
Yes.
Hovland,
Aye.
House,
Yes.
Loon,
Yes.
McGuire,
Yes.
Debjam,
Yes.
Schember,
Yes.
Sherlock, Weaver,
Yes.
Williams, Thou.
Janet is on mute. I'm sorry, but she did say yes.
Okay, and Thou.
For me, right? Yes.
Mary Liz, you are on mute as well.
Am I unmuted now?
You're good now.
Okay, sorry. So we have two presentations today. The PowerPoints were sent out last week. The first will be by legislative analyst Matt Burrs from House Research. And so we'll let him go forward with the presentation. And let me know if you have any questions. Maybe we'll try and wait till the end, but let's turn the time now over to Matt. Unless there are any questions before we start. Any questions, anybody?
Mary Liz, this is Greg. I was just going to tell people one easy way to work the volume is if you just hold down your space bar, leave it muted, leave yourself on mute. And when you want to speak, hold down your space bar and that'll toggle your mic on and off. So you can hold it down while you're speaking. And then when you're done speaking, just let up on it. And that way, hopefully that'll work out well for everybody.
All right, thank you. Anything else before we start? Great. Hey, Matt, floor is yours, or should I say the screen is yours?
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Matt Burris. I'm a legislative analyst in the nonpartisan House Research Department, and I was asked to provide an overview of transit finance. So on the next slide, we'll see a quick table of contents for what I'll be covering. And this will be pretty high level. I've got a fair number of slides, so I'm planning on moving pretty quickly through them. I think a lot of it will be review given the level of experience of many of the committee members. But hopefully there'll be some recap or reminder or a little bit of new information. So I'll be touching on finance and focusing on sources within that, and then talking about the various forms of transit service and some of the elements of transit. And there's a fair number of acronyms. So if we were in person, maybe I would do up some bingo sheets and pass them out, but just sort of leave it as there. So moving to the next slide, beginning with a general introduction. We've seen some lists like this, I think, in previous meetings. There are several different types of transit that are provided throughout the state. So I'm kind of going to take somewhat of a statewide look to begin with. So regular route is the core, generally urban, kind of a network of a set schedule, set routes. That's bus service. There are other forms of bus service that I think can sort of generally be categorized in kind of express or commuter bus as a separate category that generally has a longer distance type of coverage, fewer stops, kind of quicker getting to typically a kind of central area from a farther out area. The third general type of bus service is bus rapid transit, which again it's a network or part of a network. It's a regular route, but the spacing is a little bit broader or longer apart, and there are various kinds of upgrades that we'll be getting into, and a couple of different types of that. And then there's rail service, that sort of the obvious light rail transit and commuter rail. Again, we'll be touching on a little bit more detail behind each of those. On the next slide, there are a couple other types of transit service that are a little bit less commonly discussed or recognized. One is called demand response or dial-a-ride, and this is offered both in the Twin Cities as well as by transit providers throughout the rest of the state. And it's more, it starts to look a little bit more taxi-like in that the trips are scheduled and the routing doesn't just follow a set pattern. It's based on where folks want to go. There's also a variant off of regular route that is called route deviation. And that is somewhat like the regular route service, but there's some shifting off of the regular route based on where riders want to go. And that's found more in greater Minnesota. And then the Americans with Disabilities Act establishes requirements around transit service that's complements regular route transit. So paratransit services are provided both in the metro area, Twin Cities metro area, as well as in some of the communities in greater Minnesota. And then finally, there are a couple of types of transit that are in the project development stage. Dedicated bus rapid transit is another variant of bus rapid transit, and then streetcars is a kind of a variant of rail. Next slide, it brings us to some of the entities that are involved in transit. Again, this is a list that's similar to something that's been put out or discussed a little bit in past, so I won't just read through this. One thing I'll note is that MnDOT is involved in, particularly in transit in greater Minnesota as a distributor of aid, as well as in performing various kind of statewide transit-oriented planning functions and administration of some funds. So there are entities at the state level, the regional level, state legislature, kind of again, state level, and then moving to cities and counties. And then next slide continues our list of entities that are the providers themselves, both local units of government or governmental entities providing transit, as well as transit that's provided through contract. Obviously, the transit riders, there are a couple of other entities at the state and regional levels, as well as a local level, really. And then there are a couple of different federal agencies that get involved with transit. Then next slide, yeah, so transit service is provided obviously by a series of transit providers. It's generally at the local unit of government level. And there's quite a number of transit providers in greater Minnesota. I think that's the kind of theme that jumps out at me looking at greater Minnesota transit is the variety. There's variety in the kinds of systems. There's some statutory categorization based on systems that are in urban areas like Duluth or Moorhead versus smaller, the Hibbing, Winona type systems. And then there's also a lot of variety as far as the nature of the service, the times of day, what the routing looks like, and so forth. So on the next slide, you will see a map of the various transit providers. And that might also kind of give a sense of the variety that some transit providers are just, within a city or a city and a couple of surrounding communities or suburbs, and some are multi-county. On the next slide, continuing with the transit service, there's the Twin Cities metropolitan areas, got the Metropolitan Council and its various types of service, the suburban providers, and then a couple other providers in the Twin Cities, and we'll be kind of stepping through those a little bit more in detail. The next slide provides a kind of quick statewide rundown on ridership to kind of give you a sense of scope of transit service. And from this, you can see that dividing out the Met Council service by some of the key modes, that bus is the really big one. Rail is another large one looking statewide, and Greater Minnesota Transit, all those various providers kind of add up to a chunk. Next slide brings us to kind of a pause point. So that's the general introduction at the statewide level, and we'll be moving into finance and talking largely about some of the sources and how the transit funding can, or is, I think, arguably a tie into various types of governance questions. So next slide lists out the basic transit finance sources, and they range from the federal to the state to the local level, both regionally, Met Council wide, as well as county by county. And there are also a couple of kind of smaller sources or fairly modest sources, such as fare box recovery. It's also, I guess, you could categorize that as regional as well. So the next slide is motor vehicle sales tax. So this is a statewide tax, and it's imposed instead of the state's sales tax. So it's just on motor vehicles. It has something of an interesting history. Over time, it had gone towards the general fund and off and on towards transportation purposes. And in 2001, there was a shift from property taxes in the Twin Cities metro area forming one of the key funding streams for transit. And that was moved, in effect, moved onto the motor vehicle sales tax being the funding stream. And then there was the constitutional amendment that the voters adopted in 2006 that created a dedication to the transportation purposes from this revenue stream. And it sets some floor / ceiling. I mean, it sort of restates the same requirement in two different ways that set a minimum for transit following a phase-in. And then on the next slide, you'll see a little bit about the allocation of the motor vehicle sales tax funds. The formula, so the constitutional requirement lays out general requirement that MVEST funds have to go to transportation, but it's actually statutory what the distribution is. And that was set in statute following the constitutional amendment adoption. So the shares of 60, 36, and 4 have been in law since 2007. And there's a statutory appropriation both to MnDOT for the portion going to Greater Minnesota Transit and to the Met Council for the Twin Cities Transit funds. On the next slide, the next category is state bonds. So this is debt. I think it's important kind of to think of it in terms of it being a funding stream in a sense, but it's also a form of debt. There are a number of constitutional restrictions around how bonding, state level bonding can work. And those are implemented through the legislation that authorizes state bonds. There's a lot of variety for bonding in general, but for transit funding in particular through bonds from year to year. So there's some years in which there's a larger bond authorization and appropriation of funds, and other years in which there's no bonding bill. No comments on which category we're going to put 2020 in. There are two kinds of bonds. One is trunk highway bonds, and that's specific to the trunk highway system, statewide road system. And then there's general obligation bonds. Actually, there are more types than this, but these are kind of the two key ones. So just general GO bonds are authorized for transit as well as for various other kinds of transportation projects, as well as projects in other areas from wastewater to higher education facilities. Next slide, moving to the more regional and local level of funding. The Metropolitan Council is authorized to impose several different types of property tax levies, and one is specific to transportation. It's the Regional Transit Capital Levy, and it goes by a couple of different terms, but this is probably the most commonly one is RTC. And it is imposed in an area that's not the full jurisdiction of the Metropolitan Council. I think this had been raised maybe in a previous meeting, but I thought I would sort of step through this a little bit. In statute, there's an area that's laid out, that's just specified in state law as the transit taxing district. And there's also authority for the council to enter into agreements to broaden that geographic area. And so it has expanded over the years to include some additional communities beyond the original statutory designation. So I think terminology-wise, the RTC area is probably most commonly referred to cover both what is originally outlined in statute as well as all of the communities that have come in by agreement. So the next slide shows a map of where the levy communities are, what that area is, or put another way, what the subset is compared to the full 7-county metro area where this property tax is levied. And then next slide is the final piece on this is, well, what happens to the levy money? The revenue from the levy goes towards bonding that the Met Council is authorized under state legislation to enter into. So their Met Council issued bonds that are backed by the levy, typically every year or more recently every other year. There is an additional enacted authority. And then the bond proceeds are used towards various transit capital. Mainly it's fleet maintenance, but there's some other transit facilities that are also supported through bond proceeds. And it's also utilized as a match for federal aid. Next slide, please. So this, the county's Transit Improvement Board, CTIB, isn't in place anymore, but I think it's useful to sort of touch on or recap a little bit what the board's role had been. So in 2008, the legislature enacted a pretty substantial transportation finance package that included authority for counties in the metro area to enter into a joint powers agreement and form what became CTIB and impose a sales tax at a 0.25% rate. So that was done for a few years, and then it dissolved in 2017. Next slide. Part of the authorizing legislation identified various requirements and restrictions, and that combined with policies that CTIB created itself led to some core uses around where the revenue flowed to. And the focus was on transitways, both statutorily and in CTIB policies. So there was capital development, using the sales tax funds to create new transitways like light rail, commuter rail, the bus rapid transit system, particularly on the highway side. So the funds went both to the capital side and a portion of the operating side. And there's a little bit of funding as well for planning and development activities. Next slide. So at the same time, in 2008, when the authority for CTIB was enacted, there was also statewide authority provided to all the counties to enact a local option sales tax. And it was designed as something separate from CTIB. So those counties that were not part of CTIB could impose the separate sales and use tax. was originally somewhat restricted, but it broadened through a couple of different changes, legislative changes over time. And it allows for a rate of up to 0.5% and a set of uses that included both transit and roads. So part of what happened when CTIP dissolved is that those counties then switched over to imposing a sales tax under this separate county local option sales tax. So the rate went up from 0.25 to 0.5%, and the flexibility and use of funds expanded from more or less transitway oriented to roads or transit, or some combination. Next slide, please. Another entity involved in financing transit is also at the county level, but it's somewhat distinct. That's the county regional rail authorities that are in statute authorized as a separate political subdivision. It's maybe fair to say that it's largely the boards of the various counties wearing a separate hat, but it is a distinct political entity. And it was established or given a purpose around rail, both service and preservation of right-of-ways. And in recent years, the revenue from a authorized property tax levy has gone towards transitway development, so capital costs and some of the initial project development tasks, like analysis, feasibility study, seeing if a given corridor would be could support a transitway in the future. And there are some funding limitations that come along with the use of the levy funds, so that it's really a limitation to a portion of the capital costs and none of the operating costs. So the next slide shows a recap, so kind of wrapping up the transit finance category, but looking at it a little bit more from a standpoint of the various kinds of revenue and who's paying or where it's coming from. And I think one of the things that jumps out is the variety. So there are revenue streams that range from national down to really sub-county, and the types of taxes that are imposed that form part of the overall package of funding transit vary as well. And it's from all the different kinds of state taxes that roll together into the state's general funds to specific taxes for transit or transportation purposes to user fees. Next slide, please. So with that, I'll move into the transit, kind of providing of transit and the details of the service. And it might be the case that Judd would have some sort of prize or award for whoever can answer the how many maps are coming question, but I'm not sure. I can't confirm. Not really sure he really has that, but you never know. Okay, so moving to next slide. I'll start with a recap of what has been presented in the past. Again, looking at it slightly differently. This is to attempt to summarize some of the activities within the Met Council around transit. And it's not a full list. In particular, the council board itself is probably arguably ought to be one of the categories here is, the overall policy-making entity. But looking at some of looking at the breakdown of how the council is structured and functionally how it divides its activities, you can see a distinction between the transit provider, transit operational side versus planning and some of the project, doing the project-oriented work, and then the allocation of federal funds through TAB, as well as the input, again, on the planning side. And then there's the regional administration has, you can see a couple of those offices or entities within that are providing some of the agency-wide services. So one thing that I think this might help highlight is, while we often talk about an entity as one organization or one kind of singular entity, the Met Council, it's also can be helpful to think of it in terms of the various functions and how it's divided out and has different pieces and parts to it, if you will. On the next slide, then we'll move into a little bit more detail on the various kinds of specific service. First is regular route bus. So again, this is the fixed routes, fixed schedules, and it does get further divided in various ways, largely around whether the service itself is serving a more local subset of the community or provides service over a longer distance. And the Met Council's regular route bus system really forms the core of, or the backbone of the transit service. It's a large network, large number of routes that all connect to each other. And where there is bus service established, it's pretty short spacing. So one doesn't have to go very far to get to a transit stop if you're anywhere near the bus service. The area of the service is within that RTC levy area. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see the map of the bus system. Yeah, if we could go to next slide, please. So here you'll see a map of the bus network. It actually includes some of the other transit modes that we'll be talking about as well. You can see the yellow area outlines the regional transit capital levy area, and then the various red and yellow lines form the core of the regular route bus network. And that, if we go to the next slide, leads into transitways. So we touched on these various types of modes previously. So in the Twin Cities, there's a growing network over the last 15 years or thereabouts. And the way that the network has grown has really had a bunch of different approaches involved. So the agencies that have taken lead at different points have been different across the various projects to get new lines in place. And the overall mixture of funding has changed over time. Obviously during the era of CTIB, for instance, CTIB was a very big funder of some of these transitways, and that's no longer a functioning entity. So it has shifted for upcoming and additional lines that are undergoing project development and in a couple of cases construction. Just as an aside, this is a stylized map. Doesn't include North Star, but that's another one that I would put in this transitways category. Next slide, please. So looking at each of these, just touching on them briefly. The first is bus rapid transit, and one of the biggest features around setting it apart from just the regular route is that fare is collected before you get on. So it's one of various ways where this type of service is designed to move faster along. So there are some other enhancements that make the rider experience more appealing, arguably, such as real-time display on when the next bus is coming, some changes in the configuration of the bus, and there's sort of a distinction in the branding. But the basic part of the core basic idea is that it is faster, hence the rapid. So high frequency gets you from one point to another in a quicker period of time through some of the advantages of stoplights and technology, as well as by spacing out where the stations are. So it's not a stop every block in general. Next slide. So bus rapid transit is then further divided into two different types, arterial and highway. So as you might predict, arterial is operated generally on the arterial roads, the minor ones. So these are kind of like, well, minor arterial in the technical sense, but it's more, I think of them as like the busy commercial roadways. And then highway BRT has a good chunk of operation that's on highways. And that operation is going to be in mixed traffic in our current configuration of highway BRT. And there's then some managed lane, dedicated shoulder in order to, again, provide that advantage in travel time. And there are a couple of lines in place and in progress for arterial and highway BRT. Next slide, please. So light rail, at the risk of stating the obvious, operates on rail. So that's one, shifting over from the bus mode to the rail mode. And it has some similarities to bus rapid transit, or it's expressed the other way around, I suppose. So the stations are a little bit more developed. The general design in the Twin Cities is an open station, but they're pretty long to accommodate train length, and has fare collection that takes place before you board. This is probably the largest scale as far as capital costs as well. Next slide. So there are a handful of lines in the Twin Cities that have been established over recent years. Green Line is obviously, the extension is under construction now, and Botno is also a project that exists. I guess I'm not sure how to describe it at this stage. Next slide, please. So the other mode in rail is commuter rail, and we have North Star is our one line in the Twin Cities Metro. And this is also dedicated right-of-way rail operation. Again, larger platforms with fare collection before you board is just a couple of the features. The service is somewhat different in that there are fewer stations, it's wider apart, and the nature of the service is oriented more towards commuters. So higher degree of service in the morning going into the central downtown core of Minneapolis, and then again higher service going back out in the evening for long distance commuter orientation. Next slide, please. So that wraps up transitways. We move into some of the other types of service that the Met Council provides. And again, this is, I think, recapping somewhat what's been touched on in the past. The first of these is Metro Mobility. So this is the Met Council service that is provided to riders who can't use regular route service because of a disability. And it works as a shared ride type service. So the general public, if they are eligible, is able to use it and not be multiple people on a given route. But it is based on a reservation and scheduling type of model. And the Met Council contracts out this service. Incidentally, jumping back to the finance, the most recent biennial budget that the legislature enacted split out a general fund appropriation specifically for Metro Mobility. In recent years, the Met Council had been getting a general fund appropriation that was just broadly for transit in general. So now there's a distinction made in that use of funds. Next slide, please. Well, it's been mentioned that the Metro Mobility is a federal mandate. There's actually sort of two layers to that in the Twin Cities. There's a federal area that's based on the locations of regular route service. And then the state has a statutory area that's a bit broader and aligns more or less with the transit taxing district. So you can see on the slide the difference between those two areas. And Met Council has maintained that distinction to some extent into the service that's provided. So in the federal area, it's a comparable type of service to what's provided as part of regular route. But the council's interpretation, or sorry, finish out this other line of thought. So at the federal area, the council provides sort of full, as you know, those who are eligible get Metro Mobility service, but it's potentially more limited in that outlying gray area where if there are limitations on the availability, then somebody might have to go standby. Next slide, please. Another form of service that the council has, again, is contracted is Dial-A-Ride. And this is, again, a shared ride type of service. It's a somewhat similar model to Metro Mobility in that there's scheduling in advance, a couple of different variants on that. But in general, it's a window for when you get picked up and kind of the timing around that. And the core of Transit Link is to create some amount of transit service outside of where regular route transit is. So recall we've seen, I don't know how many maps at this point that show the transit taxing district or the regional transit capital levy area. That's a subset of the 7-county metro area. And Transit Link kind of fills in around that outside by providing for routes or for service that can then connect folks to other transit, regular route or the various transit ways. So it's not ADA service, although you know, some of the way in which the service is provided has some similarities. And then next slide, please. So the final type of service that the Met Council provides is a carpooling program in which commuters organize themselves into a group that is riding together, van pools, they call it. So it's for those who either are living or working in the 7-county metro area, and there's a subsidy for use of Met Council branded vehicles, and then the riders cover the rest of the commuting costs. That brings us to the opt-outs, the suburban transit providers. So there are several providers that perform, you know, similar regular route bus service, but it's instead of what the council provides. And this dates back to authority that was provided in the early 80s. And since that time, there have been some consolidation. So we're now at 4 transit providers. And the governance varies a little bit across those providers. In some cases, it's just a city. There are several cities that have consolidated together, and there's variance as well on who provides general oversight, whether it's just elected officials or includes some general citizens. The type of service primarily breaks down into serving, providing transit within each of those communities, and then some service that goes into the downtowns, primarily the downtowns of Minneapolis and St. Paul, as well as the University of Minnesota. So on the next slide, we can see the network of the various suburban transit providers. And you can see both the connections or the network that's in place within each of the provider service areas, as well as those kind of express route, commuter-oriented routes into downtown Minneapolis and St. Paul and the U of M. Next slide. One other thing to touch on with the suburban transit providers, the opt-outs, is the aid that goes to them. So I think of it as coming through three different sources. And the first is through the TAB, Met Council, through their regional solicitation process. I didn't go into much detail about that before, but recall from previous meetings of this committee that the TAB has a leadership on allocating a couple of different funds, federal funds under federal programs, and they use a kind of application and competitive grant making process to allocate those dollars. And it's actually split out. It's not just transit funding through that process, but there's kind of some buckets created and a set aside or a portion that's oriented to transit. And so suburban transit providers are one of the entities that seeks funds through that process. The second line of support is through bus purchases that the Met Council performs. They're buying buses both for the opt-outs and for Metro Transit. And then the third is a portion of MVEST. So the Met Council allocates and administers MVEST dollars. Part of the funding from MVEST is allocated by state statute to the opt-outs. And there's a pretty intricate formula that outlines how much goes to each of the opt-out entities. And then on top of that, there's a portion that the Met Council allocates through a regional allocation policy and process that they have established. Next slide, please. Finally, I need a lot of water. I don't think I've been talking much to humans very frequently in recent months. So final transit provider to touch on is the University of Minnesota. And somewhat parallel to the opt-outs, they have service that is both kind of within campus and connecting the Minneapolis and St. Paul campuses, the campus connector, and have some paratransit service similar to Metro Mobility. So the U of M is providing transit within its campus areas, but those campuses are also served by the various other transit providers. Next slide, please. So now we've moved on to, for lack of a better term, I came up with transit support. I'm not sure that there's a universal term for this category. So what I'm getting at here are just a couple of things to touch on that are kind of elements that also support or enhance the transit system. So next slide, the first of these is transit advantages. And the two big categories, I think, are first, shoulders on the various highway systems that are designed and allow for buses to operate. And that provides some consistency of service for buses, particularly during congested times. And the second are some of the managed lanes, which mainly boils down to MnDOT's MnPass system, which allows for both transit and single occupant vehicles that pay a toll in order to use that lane. So dedicated lanes for sort of a subset of the road users. And this again allows for some more consistency and speed of travel of the transit operators. Next slide. Another piece of transit is the parking rides, and we've seen this actually on a couple of maps. This one, this map shows the range of facilities that are spread throughout the region for parking rides, and the parking, is designed to serve transit, and so of course there's connection to various transit ways and the regular route bus system. And in some cases, there's greater integration where the park and ride is connected to a larger transit-oriented center, or it's located at a shopping mall or a commercial center, and is operated by several of the transit providers we've been going over. So next slide is the kind of the wrap up for this support category. It's kind of a catch-all that I thought was just worth touching on, that there are a bunch of other kinds of buildings and facilities and so forth that are also part and an element of the transit system. So first there are the big stations, like the hubs where multiple modes come in. Target Field, for instance, has North Star coming in along with light rail and bus nearby. And then there are also a variety of facilities and operations and maintenance and garages and so forth, spread somewhat throughout the Twin Cities. There's kind of a campus for some of this. And then some of the facilities are located where the service is. And then there are also administrative offices. That kind of wraps up the various pieces. Moving to the next slide, just have a couple of concluding comments. One is that what you see through both the finance side and transit service provision side and the elements in between, from policy making to project development, is a lot of entities involved. I doubt I've surprised anybody with this point, but just looking at the governmental entities, the mix is has a lot of involvement at various levels, from federal on down to very local. The other thing that I think jumps out is that there are various complexities where transit ties in to transportation finance more generally. So the limitations around the constitutional amendment for MVES is an example, and then transit is, at least in a sense, in competition for funding from GO bonds, general fund appropriations. So that is, I think, one of the factors whenever transportation funding or finance questions come up, is how transit and transportation more generally have a fairly intricate network of different funding streams involved. And that concludes my presentation.
Great, thanks, Matt. Does anybody have any questions at this point? Anybody? Oh, Jerry.
Just a quick question, Matt. You mentioned GO bonds are used to support the transit. Are GO bonds paid back by general fund revenues? If that's the case, that's considered sort of like general fund mechanism, right?
Yes, that Madam Chair, members of the committee, that is correct. The debt service on GO bonds is paid from the state's general fund. So I did emphasize that it's that. I tend to look at these things from the state level because of my being, state legislature bias. So from the standpoint, if you flip it from the standpoint of the transit entities or transit agencies, it's all just the states paying for this. Thank you for your aid.
Thanks.
Mayor Williams, did you have something?
I just had a clarification. When you say other local, what would that be other cities in that concluding chart for funding?
Madam Chair, members, cities was the big one I was thinking of, but I hadn't gone into, I hadn't really touched on corridor type commissions and, sort of the entities that are sometimes established to try and get transit ways going. And that kind of in retrospect, thinking about it a little bit here, I would have made sense to delve into that a bit because of the transit way development aspect and how a distinction can be drawn on the development activities that some entities enter into to kind of get a new transit way, say a new highway BRT or dedicated BRT line going versus who the operator is or who the funding parties are in order to actually build and then operate and maintain that infrastructure.
Mayor Hovland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This might disclose my bias with respect to our hybrid MPO, but with respect to the tab, it almost seems to me that the tab ought to be involved in that chart on slide 46 with respect to the policymaking, revenue and funding recommendations and planning that it's doing. It doesn't provide the transit service and doesn't provide the studies and the project development the way the council does. But as people are going back through materials that aren't familiar with the intricacies of the operations that are conducted over there, it seems to me that there could be some benefit in having the hybrid MPO functions laid out pretty specifically.
Thank you for that. Any other questions? So, Matt, I have one. I think it was a good idea that they pulled out Metro Mobility as a separate line item for budget purposes. I've often thought, in addition, that should be a forecasted program. Can you talk to us a little bit, to the degree you know, to what degree do transit systems in greater Minnesota provide ADA transportation services? And are there cross subsidies or, with the majority of the ADA funding for greater Minnesota coming in the Health and Human Services budget as opposed to the transportation budget, are there systems that do both and get funding from both MnDOT and HHS, or how does that work?
Madam Chair, my familiarity with that is pretty broad and high level. My understanding is, well, first I'm pretty comfortable stating that there is ADA service that's provided in Greater Minnesota among a couple of the transit providers. It's really driven by the federal requirements when there's a regular route bus network. So that ADA service is in places like St. Cloud and Duluth that have an urban bus network. And so the funding stream from both general fund and a portion of MVest, MnDOT allocates out, is going to be supporting both regular route and ADA service. I'm not aware of additional or kind of wraparound HHS funding that goes towards those transit providers. So I guess I can't really speak further to whether that's an additional funding stream, but I suspect not. I suspect that the state aid dollars and whatever local effort the transit those communities are putting in are how their ADA service is funded.
All right, thank you. Any other questions before we move on?
Madam Chair, hey, it's Doug Loon.
Yeah.
Just a quick question. Matt, thank you. Great overview. It definitely demonstrates the complexity of the transit equation. But I'm really curious about operating specifically. What are the various components that contribute to supporting transit here in the metro for operating, and I'm really curious how much percentage the fare box typically covers during a normal year, not a non-COVID year.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, I don't have a lot of the details in front of me on the breakdown in operating costs. I think there are some slides that the Met Council had sent out previously that get into the budgeted, but generally Farebox is a somewhat smallish, but varying depending on the mode amount. I'm kind of hesitant to say where I think it is, but maybe Judd could jump in if he had something further on that.
Hi, everybody. Just to weigh in here on your question, Doug, I think what would be best if I just get that information and send it around to the committee. Matt is right that the fare box per passenger subsidies look different based on the different type of services we have on the street, local bus, express bus, North Star, light rail, they all look different. And things have looked incredibly different here since the pandemic. So I think it would be fair for us to send you both, since your question was, what did it look like? I think that we can send you both of those figures. And we'll just provide that for all regional transit providers.
Sounds great.
Judd,
thank you.
Judd, I want to be clear. What you're going to send us is the cost of each mode of transit, correct? The cost per ride for each mode.
That's correct. And I'll do that. And I'll send the pre-COVID numbers as well, just because things look so rough right now when we know that our express ridership is really struggling and North Star ridership is really struggling, that it just doesn't paint a picture of what it will look like when we get to the other side of this.
Yeah.
Well, and I think there's going to be a couple ways to look at it, and we'll work on, I mean, you can slice and dice figures any way you want. I mean, some would look for subsidy per ride. Some would look at subsidy per passenger mile. So I think that we should probably look at a variety of ways to show where the subsidy lines up. But it can, I mean, it used to be the best performing route was the Lakeville Express route, where the fare box was over 73% of the operating costs. But on system-wide, I'm guessing that you're in the low 30s at best when you
for express bus.
Yeah, right. So, and some are really super bad. If you look at the red line before they reduced the frequency, I think the subsidy each way was like over $20 per passenger. So, I mean, they can get really large subsidies as well. So we'll get a variety of information on the fare box recovery. And when you get into the Metro Transit and the Metro Mobility and some of those, they're really expensive per ride. So.
Madam Chair, can I just offer as well? I think it's helpful to see that information for all of the providers. But I would also offer that it's maybe useful to just kind of have an understanding of where we fit as we compare to other systems across the country. So if we're looking at fare box recovery or any of the ADA subsidy.
And I would think this would be a good time too to also look at the subsidies in the opt-out systems as well. So look at the performance levels of the opt-out system. So this might take us a little while to pull it together, but I think it'll be helpful for the evaluation. Any other questions for Matt before we go to Judy? All right, seeing none. Judy, do you want to start?
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair and members. It's nice to see a lot of old familiar faces and see some new ones. Oh, I'm Judy Randall. I'm the Deputy Legislative Auditor for the Office of the Legislative Auditor's Program Evaluation Division. Yes, that is a mouthful. And I have the dubious honor of having been the manager of our evaluation back in 2011 on the governance of transit in the Twin Cities region. So Judd asked me to talk a little bit about the kind of some of the key findings and recommendations we had out of that evaluation. And of course, I'm happy to do it, but I do want to note that this is based on an evaluation we conducted about 10 years ago. Some of it is still relevant, which is interesting, and we can discuss why that is. But also, I would just say some of it is dated. So please understand that caveat. I also just want to really thank Matt Burris for that really thorough overview that will help eliminate some of the things I need to talk about because he covered it so well. Also, I just want to apologize in advance that some of my slides, notably the spider web one, from those of you who remember this presentation, will require a number of clicks, and I'm not controlling the PowerPoint slide, so I'll probably be saying click more than anything else for a little while, so my apologies on that. So if we could go to the next slide. Thank you. I'll just, real quickly, these were the types of services that we included in our evaluation. I will note that our evaluation was just focused on transit and not the whole, not all of the services that the Met Council is responsible for. But we did look at how the governance of transit in the Twin Cities, and we looked at all of these different types of transit. Go ahead and go to the next slide. I'll just jump kind of to our bottom line. These were the two key legislative recommendations that I thought would be the most relevant for this group. Our recommendation, the big one, was that the legislature should restructure the Metropolitan Council, and we'll talk more about that, I'm sure, as we go through this. And then also we recommended that the legislature clarify the goals and priorities of transit in the Twin Cities region. And really, a lot of this is getting at the complexity that Mr. Burris talked about and you all saw, and we'll talk about a little bit more as I go through my slides as well. If you could go to the next slide, I'll just I'll quickly note some of the good news. Again, this is old. This is based on 2009 data, but one of the things we did do is look at how the Twin Cities transit system performed relative to 11 peers. And the peers included Denver, Phoenix, Portland, and Seattle. I think you may have a copy of the report if you're interested in seeing the list of our peers. They're on page 101 of our report. I don't know if you have it on hand or not. And we did look at some of these things that you were just talking about, fare recovery percentage, subsidy per passenger, things like that. But again, our data are from 2009, so I think Judd can get you some better information. But I think it's important to note that the transit system performed relatively well. It performed well on efficiency, what we called efficiency measures, so those measures that you were just talking about, but also on service use and access measures. So I think that was a really encouraging part of our evaluation. Next slide, please. But despite the good performance, what we found were some significant problems with the governance structure. And the problems we found with complexity and overlapping priorities and so many actors involved, I think really adds this level of complexity that makes everything difficult. Okay, so now we're going to have a lot of clicks. So if you could do a click for me, you'll see, okay, so there's the Metropolitan Council and then the Transportation Advisory Board. You all know about these well, and of course TAB is in place because the federal requirement for an MPO to have elected representation. And of course, as you know, Met Council members are all appointed. So these are two of the key entities in the Twin Cities area that establish transit policy, establish transit priorities, transit goals, operate transit, kind of key player. If you could click. We also have, and of course, Mr. Burris talked on some of this too about the complexity. We have the county boards of the 7 counties in the metropolitan area, and we also have the regional railroad authorities for each of those 7 counties. Again, membership on those two entities within a county are generally the same. It's generally the county commissioners, but it's like a double layer of organizations that are establishing priorities, establishing timelines, goals, having to be coordinated with and involved in these transit decisions. If you could click again, as Mr. Burris mentioned, the CTIB, the County's Transit Improvement Board, was created in 2008. He explained what it was. It was this joint powers board where counties in the metropolitan area could join it and levy this additional tax. And then these counties work together to establish their own set of priorities and then funding for both developing the transit ways and operating those transit systems. So you can see in green the counties that chose to participate in CTIP. If you could click again. At the time we did this evaluation, there were 6 suburban transit providers, and they're down there in the red. And then if you could click again, please. Thank you. These are those commissions that Mr. Burris mentioned a little bit. These are, different commissions that grow up around specific corridors where they have a specific interest in their transit ways and are pushing to get those through. At the time when I did this evaluation and first made this presentation, this was kind of the map of the transit governance structure. And what I said at the time, and which I think still holds true, is it's not really a clear structure where there's clear lines of authority, where there's clear lines of decision making, how funding flows or how priorities or goals are set. Rather than those clear lines, it's just more of a spider web. It's kind of what I said at the time, and I think that still holds true. Of course, since we did the evaluation, if you could click, please, CTIB was dissolved. Thank you. And so now CTIB is no longer there, which, does reduce by 1 the number of organizations with which to coordinate. But then, of course, it also means that now each county is back to being its own single actor rather than maybe acting in a more coordinated way through CTIB. I don't know. I haven't looked into to see what the impact is of the dissolution of CTIB, but I could anticipate seeing some benefits and some drawbacks from that change. And then if you could click one more time, please. Thank you. Now, 2 of the suburban transit providers have consolidated. Shakopee and Prior Lake are now part of MBTA. So now we have 4 suburban transit providers. So while Mr. Burr showed you a really nice, neat table of kind of the different actors and who's involved with what, I'm showing you this really messy slide. And it's kind of overwhelming and it's kind of complicated. And yes, I know people who are in the system understand how all of these people and groups work together and maybe their different roles, but you can see how there's a lot of complexity around this. And this is kind of the current situation we have right now on transit governance. If you could click, I think we're done with that slide. Thank you. You did a great job clicking through all of that. Thank you. And so there are some challenges, as a result of our governance structure regarding transit in the Twin Cities. The complexity, I think, was evident, and the fragmentation, because you have all those different organizations involved. And I would note that complexity in of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing if everyone can work together. But what we found when we did this evaluation, again, 10 years ago, was that there was a lot of distrust among some of the transit organizations, most notably between the suburban transit providers and Metropolitan Council. And those tense relationships make things harder. I mean, they make things harder even when things are easy and straightforward. But when you already have a complex system with competing goals and not a clear, one person gets to make the decisions, it just makes things that much more difficult. There's also a lot of time spent coordinating with all these different parties. Different people have to get together to meet, to include the right parties. Sometimes you go to a meeting, but it turns out it wasn't really related to you, but you had to be included. So there's just a lot of time and energy spent on trying to coordinate. And then, of course, there's not an agreed upon set of priorities. There's some general consensus, but I think within the different, for sure the different corridor commissions, but then, by county, by Met Council, by TAB, everybody's got their own different set of priorities. When we did this evaluation, again, 10 years ago, there was really widespread belief that the next transitway that was going to be developed was really just the one that was going to be ready next, or the one that had the most money behind it, not necessarily the one that best served the interests of the region. Okay, if you could go to the next slide, please. I'm kind of zipping through all this, so I'm happy to answer questions, but kind of aware of our time too. So another complication we found when we were doing this evaluation was that the composition of the council itself contributed to the challenges. I will note that when we started this evaluation, we were asked to look at governance of transit in the Twin Cities. I was on record saying we are not looking at the composition of the Metropolitan Council. That is out of scope. Met Council does a lot more than transit. We are only looking at transit. We are not going to address the composition of the Metropolitan Council. And then we started talking to people, and every single conversation we had was about the composition of the Metropolitan Council. And it came to a point where I thought, okay, we can't not talk about it. It is the elephant in the room, and we wouldn't be doing our job if we didn't. So I know that there's some folks who criticized us, and I think it's fair to say we only looked at transit. We didn't look at everything the Met Council did. How can you make this very big recommendation about changing the composition of the Met Council? And I guess my answer to that is we just simply couldn't avoid it. But what we found, at least for the transit, is that this composition really does make things harder. As you know, members are appointed by the governor. And as a result, there's limited accountability to the public. There's a lot of concern that the Met Council levies this tax, but again, it's levied by people who are not elected. So there's not that, there's the taxation without representation claim. Also, the folks who are appointed to the commission by the governor are there representing regions of areas of the Twin Cities metropolitan region. Yet many folks we spoke to at the time who were key transit representatives, organizers, key members of organizations didn't necessarily know who their Met Council representative was, hadn't had conversations with them, that person hadn't reached out to them. So there wasn't this belief that the Met Council member was really representing the region or the interests of the region, again, within the broader Twin Cities region. There's also concern about stability of the Metropolitan Council as an organization. Because the governor can appoint all new members when he or she takes office, there's the opportunity for the governor to replace all of the members. And with that, you lose kind of the institutional knowledge, you lose that history, you lose, again, that depth, I think, in understanding among members. And then frankly, because of questions about the composition of the council, that in itself we found contributed to the large number of transit organizations in the region. Because people didn't have confidence in the council, other structures sprouted up. So you had the suburban transit providers that were kind of put in place in a way to somewhat circumvent the council. Similarly, CTIB was created as a way to in part circumvent the council. So again, this lack of confidence in the council and the way the council is composed contributed to the complexity of the number of transit organizations in the region. So we looked, if you can go ahead and click to the next slide, thank you. We looked at a number of different options for restructuring. Again, if you have the report in front of you, we have a table on page 49 that lays out the 5 options we considered. One of the options was just maintaining the status quo. And we measured them against a whole bunch of different kind of best practices related to governance, things about promoting effectiveness and providing stability, and just looking at the table, providing accountability. We also looked at the extent to which these options were politically feasible, because we understand the environment in which we all live. And so ultimately we made a recommendation, and I should note that in the report, if you haven't looked through it, we go through these different options and we lay out the pros and cons, and there are pros and cons to all approaches for sure. We ended up recommending what's called option 2. It's not a creative name, unfortunately, which results in a mix of appointed and elected members who serve staggered terms. We think this would improve accountability, credibility, and stability, and that ultimately it could have the potential to more streamline governance. I mean, the idea is that restructuring the council this way is a first step. Doing this alone wouldn't reduce the fragmentation, but once this is in place, some other changes could potentially be considered. If you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So other things that could maybe come if the changes to the council composition were made. The first is related to the Transportation Advisory Board. And if the council did have elected representation, then you would meet the federal requirements and would not need to have a separate, you would not need to have the tab as a separate entity to fulfill the MPO requirements. I want to point out that this recommendation is not about the job the people on the tab have done. It is not at all a statement on the quality of their work. It's simply about trying to reduce the complexity and increase the efficiency and affect, the functioning of transit in the Twin Cities. CTIB, it's gone, so that's no longer relevant. Our point there was, as long as it levies a tax, it should have control over how the funds are directed. But now that that's gone, that's one step towards streamlining things. Metro Transit and Met Council is here because we had questions, and this relates to one of the slides Mr. Burris talked about all the different functions that are handled within the Metropolitan Council. And there were concerns that there was a conflict of interest between Met Council having both a planning role and an operations role. And so we, as part of our evaluation, we looked at those concerns. We were not able to substantiate those concerns. We could not substantiate that there was a conflict of interest. And at the time we did this evaluation, Met Council was rolling out some updated procedures on how to handle things. And we thought that was a really good step in making sure they were handling consistently both Metro Transit and the suburban transit providers' activities. And then we also recommended some consolidation within or among the suburban transit providers. I think if we were starting from scratch, none of us would design the system that we currently have. And so our thought was that there were opportunities for consolidation, I think among Shakopee and Prior Lake, and also among Maple Grove Transit and Plymouth Metrolink. So I know that two of those, the Shakopee and Prior Lake, have now merged with MBTA, so that there has been some consolidation in that area. I think so. Next slide. I think that's all my comments. I know I went really quickly, Madam Chair. I wanted to leave some time for questions, and I'm happy to answer any of them. There's a super high level overview of kind of what we found, and I know some of it is a little controversial, so happy to talk about it. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I see Connie's got his hand up, and then Peter will be after that.
I beat Mr. Bell. I had one question about the efficiency. You had on the slide, you talked about efficiency, and that can be a good term and it could be a slippery slope depending on what you're talking about. Is that strictly a dollar? Is that a dollar, maybe a ratio of fare box to total operation cost type of a number comparison to our peer cities? Was that more of efficiency in terms of how we're structured and governed and stuff like that?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think the part where we had the efficiency measures, it was where we were talking about how we compared to peers, right? Is that what you're referring to? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So those were more economic measures. So it was not looking at the governance so much as just kind of the dollars and cents per passenger mile, how much it costs compared with fare box. So we did look at just some of those very standard metrics across the peer groups to see how we were performing compared to our peers. And again, the region performed well on those measures.
Do you recall, if I may, a quick follow-up, you tell how we compared as far as how complex the whole structures looked? Or was that too long ago?
Madam Chair, thank you for acknowledging it was a long time ago. What I can tell you, and I know we developed a memo follow-up for a number of people, we were the most complex in terms of having the tab kind of as the MPO. So that was something that was really different than our peer regions. Most of them had a mix of elected officials kind of embedded in their equivalent to Met Council, so they didn't need to have a separate tab type of organization. But I will note that this evaluation took 3 people a whole year to do, just to understand our region and our transit, so we couldn't really dive deeply and do a comparable look at the governance structure in our peer regions to the same level.
All right, Peter.
Madam Chair, Ms. Randall, I have a question about your recommendation for elected officials and appointed officials. Could you go into any more depth on how that would roll out? In other words, how many elected officials, how many appointed officials, who would appoint the non-elected officials? Would they come from large metropolitan areas or small metropolitan areas? Because the devil, of course, is always in the details. And so I would appreciate the thinking of the legislative auditor at that time on those really very, very important questions.
Madam Chair and Mr. Bell, thank you. It's nice to see you again.
Yes.
The devil is in the details, certainly. And we dip our toe into it in the report. And at that time, we didn't flesh it out probably as much as you would like. But we had a couple of options. I guess I'll answer maybe the second part first. In terms of the appointed members, our vision was that those would still be appointed by the governor. So those that were to be appointed would still be appointed by the governor. It's just that not all members would be appointed by the governor. And there were a couple of different thoughts we had. One was a county commissioner from each of the 7 counties would be on the council. And so that would be a way to get an elected representative from, each county within the region. So I'm looking again in our report on page 44. So one of the options we say is 1 county commissioner from each of the 7 counties and 9 gubernatorial appointees, with the chair also appointed by the governor. Another would be 1 local elected official from each of the council's existing districts, and then additional members, including the chair, appointed by the governor. I think that, the world is your oyster in this, unfortunately, and you could change the size of the Met Council. You could use a nominating committee. I know there's been interest in nominating committee. I also know that when we came out with this, one of the criticisms we received was concern about a local elected official playing a dual role, and that there was concerns about that. I'm not sure, but I know Judd would know, Metro Cities, I think that's the organization, was had a lot of concerns about that proposal of having local elected officials serve also on the Met Council. So if it's something you want to dig into, just trying to be, as transparent as possible, that's probably something that you might want to hear from, because there were other concerns. I liked personally, I thought a county commissioner from each county, and then plus appointed members by the governor, there was some symmetry to that seemed to make sense. But then there's questions about, well, not all counties have the same population. So do you do it based on population, right? And so then do you have more from Hennepin and fewer from, pick your county? And as you pointed out, and as I acknowledged, devil's in the details. I do think, I will say this, I think moving to staggered terms, if nothing else, is a really good step. And that's not what we recommended. We recommended option 2, which is further than that. It's staggered terms plus this local representation mix. I think if you as a group could move really simply to staggered terms, that would be a big step. And I think it's doable. But I have thought it was doable for 10 years and it still hasn't happened. So I obviously don't know what's politically feasible or not, because I'm nonpartisan and I avoid those things. So anyways, long rambling answer.
I might add, I think there is more of a consensus on the staggered terms. I think there's fairly broad consensus on that. I think you raised some of the problems, particularly regarding population, with 1 county commissioner from each of the 7 counties. I think Hennepin County would and Ramsey County would raise significant concerns about that. Or at least they have. When I was chair of the council and talked to them about that, there was huge concerns about that.
And I get it, right? I get that, and that makes sense. And there's ways to deal with that. If there's a real desire to make it happen, I think there's ways to deal with that. CTIB had a creative way of handling the votes, right? By taking into consideration population and other things. So I think there's ways to deal with it, but it's work. It's a lot of work to make those changes happen.
Anybody else with questions? Mayor Coates.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Randall, one of the things that we talked about, and perhaps Peter and Connie and the others, like Pahua, when we were with the Citizens League and did that deep dive, one of the things that we talked about when you look at the makeup of the Met Council, we did go for a staggered term, and that was adopted also heavily from metro cities. But the other part, when you're looking at elected officials, and then you ask the question, what is the role of the Met Council and what systems does it work on? So housing is one of those things, land use, all of those are functions that are within cities. And so we said, you need to take a look at that. Those activities are city activities. Land use, which is one of the biggest things where we all file our comprehensive plan, and it has to do with land use. It has to do with, you now have goals from the Met Council with regard to housing stock and how that's distributed. So where does that all happen? It happens in cities. So I think we need to take a look at that. One of the things that the municipalities pushed back on is that, to have one representative, who makes that decision from a county? Who makes that decision? Would that be the governor? Nobody had an answer. So I think something we need to really think hard on when we do things like this. But we did go with the staggered terms, but let's look at the function of the Met Council and who does it impact the most.
If I could just respond, Madam Chair, I think those are all good questions and the right ways to think about this. I know that there was a proposal to have a nominating committee, and so maybe you have a nominating committee among a collection of cities or a collection of counties or within a county. And then of course I know it's, well, who's on the nominating committee? We could take this forever. I get it. But at some point, we got to make decisions. Right now, the governor's deciding all of the members. So, is that perfect? I don't think so. And so maybe any alternative you think of isn't going to be perfect. And the question is it going to move us closer to where we want to get?
All right. Any other questions for Judy? Eileen.
I tried Greg's tip on the space bar and it just ended up moving something else on my screen. Sorry. So thanks for that presentation. I appreciate it. I just have a couple of questions. You provided a quick overview of, basically saying you were looking at the structure of governance over the transit function, but ultimately came to a broader conclusion over the structure and governance of the council as a whole. And I think especially if you look at peer regions across the country and looking at their governance of transit and transportation generally, especially as the MPO, it does feel like it's a little bit cleaner to have, it's easier to kind of make a more general I think governance statement when you're just looking at that component of it. And then you talked a little bit about not finding the concerns about the conflicts of the other roles of the council and really understanding that there's wastewater. Mayor Counts was just talking about some of the land use, the long range planning, that kind of thing. That's also a responsibility of the council. Can you talk a little bit more about the potential and the concerns that you've heard from people about that potential conflict of having an elected serving in a kind of regulatory capacity over some of the systems that the council is responsible for?
Madam Chair, and Ms. Chermoff, it's a good question. I don't think I'm the best person to speak to it, to be honest with you. I just wanted to kind of acknowledge that we had heard those concerns. I think metro cities would be a better group to hear from on that, because I don't want to half represent it. Do you know what I mean? And I don't want to minimize it. and I don't know if Judd has thoughts and maybe he can add. I'm sorry that I don't feel like I can give you a fair response to that, and I want to make sure it's honored.
I can jump in real quick and just say that we do have Metro Cities will be participating in the next meeting, and so I think Patty Nauman and her folks will be able to speak to that. I also know that a few of the members of this committee have also spent time commenting on that at the legislature when these issues have come up in the past, and I think that we'll have a full conversation about that when Patty comes and presents where Metro Cities kind of lands on that issue.
And that might be a good segue into wrapping up here. Any other quick questions for Ms. Randall?
Thank you.
Okay, seeing none, I think what we'll do is we will resend out the report from the legislative auditor, because I know you all read the more than 100-page report when we send it out around Labor Day. I can't find mine, so maybe we can resend that out. There's lots of really good information in that report. We do have a number of organizations that'll be presenting in 2 weeks. I don't know, Judd, if you want to outline who's confirmed for that meeting.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. We will have representatives from the suburban transit providers. We will have representatives from Metro Cities. We will also have folks from the League of Minnesota Women Voters. Also, we've invited the Metro Government's Transparency Initiative. And then there was one other group. Oh, and then, excuse me, and the Citizens League are going to make a presentation, and that will be done by a couple of our committee members, Pat Bourne and Pahua Yang Hoffman, who participated in that work, as well as did a number of the members of this committee. So we will have a big meeting again here in a couple weeks to cover some of that. Just so folks know, I've asked that the folks provide about 5 minutes of testimony each, and then to provide whatever materials they have in advance so we can maximize the time to kind of cover the main points that they want to make, but also allow you as the committee members the opportunity to review the information and be prepared with whatever questions you may have. So I also anticipate that we may have a few other people sign up in the meantime, but that's where we're at for now.
Okay, any additional questions before we adjourn?
Yeah, Madam Chair.
Mayor Hovland.
Thank you. I think this is for Judd. I'm wondering, in the context of the work being done by 10 years ago now by the auditor, if they ever attended any meetings. I was on the tab at the time. I don't remember them attending any meetings there and observing firsthand some of the ongoing activities of the tab or the Met Council. Maybe you could speak to the Met Council.
Madam Chair and Mayor Hovland, I can't speak for Judy. I know she's still on the meeting here about whether or not they attended them or not. I'm assuming that if they didn't, they probably streamed them and watched them. That way, they may not have been in present exactly. But I'm going to defer to Judy here. I see her right now.
Madam Chair and Mayor Hovland, we did. We attended council meetings and we attended tab meetings, and then we interviewed. I don't believe we interviewed you, but we interviewed a sample of folks who served on those committees.
Did you take into consideration, Judy, any of the workloads of the county commissioners in looking at the selection of option 2? I'm thinking about the Met Council people that I know that are spending 20 to 30 hours a week at their job. And you got a county commissioner, it's a full-time job. What were your observations from an auditor standpoint about the ability of the county commissioner to dedicate the kind of time involved over and above what they were doing as an elected official to do an effective job at the Met Council?
Madam Chair and Mayor Hovland, I don't know. Is anyone else having feedback? Sorry.
Yeah. Unfortunately, there feels like somebody's in a factory or something.
I think Connie, if you could mute, you keep showing as speaking there. Thank you. I think that's helpful. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't mean to. Thank you.
I think that fixed it.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Mayor Hovland, it is a concern, and I think it's a fair point, and it's a point we heard, especially related to the county commissioners, that they are already swamped and have a big job, and to do Met Council justice, it's setting them up to fail, and then it's setting up Met Council to fail, and that may be why doing the county commissioner route along with the population representation isn't the best option. Maybe it's doing the local elected officials. I'm just making things up now, which is always dangerous, and my information is old. But how are the how is the tab membership selected, and is that a model that we could build off of for getting local elected representation on the Met Council, and morph them, and so it's not just get rid of tab, but it's somehow use the model that's used on the tab to get the local elected representation, and have that get merged into how we're doing representation on the Met Council. I don't know. I'm just free forming, which is really dangerous for me to do. So I'll stop. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions? All right.
I'm sorry to drag us out, but this is really interesting, and thank you for the presentation.
No problem.
Was there any discussion during the audit about the strength and diversity of point of view, that the different boards or different entities that all came together? Was there any discussion about that being a potential strength, or was it all about efficiency and other things? Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks, Madam Chair. It's a great question, and certainly you don't just want one view of how this should be, right? And so of how, and by this I mean how transit in the metro area should be. And there's definitely an interest in getting input, but I think what's hard is when there's not a clear set of goals that we're all working toward, or a clear set of decision makers. So when you have different groups with kind of their own pots of money, frankly, that can then go off and be like, well, we care more about this, so we're going to do this. That's where it got problematic. So I think figuring out a way to still get that diversity of input, absolutely, but having it be all kind of driving towards a cohesive goal, and with a clear set of folks who can make the decisions, and then put the weight of the region behind those decisions and make them happen, right? As opposed to competing against each other.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anything else? All right, well, thank you, everybody. We will be back in 2 weeks, and rather than a roll call from adjournment, as long as we're running late, I'm just going to say we're adjourned. So take care. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Matt and Judy.